Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the VM47 and how remote sensing is being applied in the context of smallholder farmer projects for dynamic baselining and for long-term carbon monitoring. My name is Andrea Sabelli. I am moderating today's session, so really excited to be here today with the panelists. I am the Director of Impact at Pure, and I've been working in the carbon and climate space for about 20 years, and always in the area of agroforestry and smallholder farmer projects. At Pure, my team's responsible for validating and verifying our carbon projects related to agroforestry and regenerative agriculture, as well as measuring biodiversity and livelihood impacts. Pure has been working in the smallholder space since 2008. Our first project was verified under the old Vera ARR methodology back then in 2008. And as of today, we have approximately 16 carbon agroforestry projects under Vera Gold Standard and Sustained Cert. As of today, we do not have a project on Vera with the VM47. So for a bit of context, throughout the years, we've been working in this field. We've built a strong understanding of some of the challenges and complexities of working with smallholders, everything from on-the-ground in-field implementation, as well as from going through the carbon certification process. Some of these challenges include collecting and processing thousands of data from thousands of parcels and thousands of farmers. We often work in very, very small plot sizes. So these areas can be less than 0.5 hectares. So also finding access to reliable satellite imagery tends to be a challenge. And then, of course, the ongoing engagement and community support that's needed for these projects. So we're always looking for new tools and technology to bring into our projects to help build efficiencies and really help to address some of the challenges that we face, especially when it comes to carbon modeling. So with the launch of the VM47, we're really excited to learn more about how remote sensing and the use of the dynamic baseline can be applied in our projects to maybe ease some of these challenges. But also we're aware that today there may continue to be some limitations. So want to also understand what those are. And since the launch of the dynamic baseline, it has become seen in the market as an indicator of a high quality and a high quality carbon project. So really want to delve deep into that topic further and understand whether that's also applicable in the smallholder context. And before we go on to the introductions of the panelists, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. Some of us may not be always working with smallholder farmers. So what is a smallholder farmer? It's a farmer that has 1 to 10 hectares of land. This could vary across the different countries. These farmers are usually producing for subsistence purposes, as well as cash crops and commodity crops. And when they enter carbon projects, they usually don't put all their land into a carbon project. They would put a small portion of that land. As a result, the land sizes are very small when they participate. So again, to emphasize, the 1 hectare or below 1 hectare is very common when working with smallholders. So the structure of today's session will be first a quick introduction from each of our panelists. We'll then have a series of questions to set a little bit more of the context, and then we'll go into presentations from each panelist. And then we hope to have at least 10 minutes at the end for Q&A coming from the audience. So first, I'll pass it on to maybe Spencer to give us a quick introduction.
Great. Thanks, Andrea, and thanks for setting the scene for this presentation. Really excited to be here and to be able to talk through some of these issues. We know that this is a really important group and a group of stakeholders that can have a lot of impact on the ground. It also, can demonstrate that both carbon projects and food production and livelihoods can work well together in the same landscape. And I think that's a really driving force behind us wanting to provide more clarity and make sure that where possible, carbon projects can be developed with smallholders. So I'm Spencer Plum. I'm Senior Manager of Forest Carbon Innovation at Vera. I've been with Vera for about 4 years, and Vera, as probably most of you know, is a standard setting body. We operate the verified carbon standard under the VCS, and that's where VM47, as it's often known, our afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation methodology is housed. And I've worked on VM47 for almost all of my time at Vera. I was joining just as it was is being developed, and so have been deeply integrated in that work and excited to be talking with folks and working with lots of different folks that are using this methodology. So that's given me a lot of touch points with groups like Pure, groups like CANUP and other data service providers, and just really excited to have this forum to be able to have a conversation, kind of keep it probably too high level for a lot of folks that will have more in-depth questions, but hopefully it's a way to guide you in looking for more information about this. So I will pass it on to Louis.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Andrea, and hi, everyone. I'm Louis. I'm the CTO and the co-founder of CANUP. We created CANUP 5 years ago. And one of the mission at that time was already to enable smallholders to access the carbon markets. And at CANUP, I'm responsible of the development of the remote sensing models. We'll be telling you a little bit more about this. But what we do at CANUP is we support project developers throughout the whole life cycle of the project development. So from feasibility studies up until monitoring, and we do so with both data products that would be work on biomass estimates, for instance, but also services. And a lot of the work we do is also under VM47. So it's exciting to be here today and discuss about this more specifically. And Margarita, if you want to continue.
Thank you so much, and very excited to be here today. My name is Margarita Vides, and I work for Schneider Electric Advisory Services since about 2 years ago. The emphasis of my career has always been GIS. I worked for the NGOs, for academia, for the government, and the private sector, always with GIS as the center of our activities. And specifically for the development of forest carbon projects, I started doing that about 10 years ago for the Guatemalan government, where I worked as the person who wrote the work plan for the subregional baseline of one of our subregions. And right now for Schneider Electric, I'm really happy to be participating in as geoenvironmental monitoring manager, where we make sure that our investors and our partners know where is the source of every offset that we produce. And also very happy to be working with the support of CANUP in the implementation of the VM47 methodology for one of our projects in India. And thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So first, I'd like to start with a question for each of the panelists, the same question that is. So from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge to the implementation of smallholder farmer projects from the perspective of your organization? So maybe we could start with Margarita first.
I'm gonna be more graphic with my answer when I do my presentation, but the biggest challenge is that we are managing very big territories where sometimes we have very hard to reach areas, and just the being able to monitor our plots from space allows us to not only harmonize the data that we gather, harmonize the methods that we analyze it with, and also to be able to reach them without having to spend maybe days and weeks on the field. So that would be the first answer. That's been very important in the resource saving aspect of the project.
Thank you. And Luis?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. I think for us, the biggest challenge would be trust, specifically building confidence between project developers and digital MRV providers. Remote sensing is not new. It's been there for decades, but its applicability to remote sensing, to MRV, sorry, specifically for smallholders, is relatively new. And so it's most natural that there's a bit of apprehension from the project developers. And we see this at Canop as perhaps some sort of a bottleneck that we think slowed down a bit the project implementation. But happily, we will try to cover most of these doubts and apprehensions during this webinar.
Perfect. Thank you. And Spencer?
Yeah, I think from Vera's perspective, we want to be taking on the perspective of project developers, and so through that lens, we really do see the biggest challenge is working with people on the ground and ensuring that those individuals that are making the choice to participate have what they need to be successful. So I really think that that is at the core of what makes a successful project. A lot of the other technical details that we're talking about today, hopefully are going to fade a little bit once you get the project up and running, and they're not going to be so much the focus. We understand that there's a real need to have these strong technical requirements, and that can often add this layer of complexity that may present sort of a barrier to entry for a lot of projects. But our hope is that with continuing education on through sessions like this and development of new tools, like some of the work that we're doing to digitize our methodologies and put a lot of that work online so that you can upload a lot of the information in a dynamic baseline and just streamline that process, that then the real focus of these projects can be enrolling and engaging communities and individuals, and that hopefully takes a bit of a burden off of the project proponents, because that's really where their work needs to be, is with communities.
Great, thank you. I think we'll dig more into that later on. Maybe just staying with you, Spencer, can you give us a little bit of context about what were some of the challenges that Vera was trying to address when you were developing the VM47?
Sure, yeah. We built VM47, I think, because we saw an opportunity to leverage remote sensing in a new way. There'd been, at that time, a lot of talk about use of remote sensing in carbon methodologies, but we hadn't really seen somebody put it to use in a way that was super compelling. And so, I think it came out of this criticism of some of the previous methodologies that, they might set a baseline, and that baseline, could have been representative of what was happening at that time. But as that project sort of matured and as situations on the ground changed, that baseline maybe didn't really represent what was happening in places where projects didn't exist. And so VM47 was a way to kind of bring the remote sensing to solve that through these quasi-experimental designs, which are basically at the core of what a dynamic baseline is. That we're able to bring together, the most recent information on land use change and look at that in the context of, what's a good match for this project. And so if we can build those composite controls, we actually have these baselines that do a great job of representing what would have happened in absence of the project. And to some of the points earlier, that really addresses one of the integrity issues of carbon projects, is knowing or understanding what could have happened without this carbon funding. So we see it as a great opportunity to advance that, and we've been really pleased with the response to VM47. So just a couple data points that we think are good signs of success. We're obviously going to continue watching this, but I think the things that we're seeing from our side are that first, we got ICVCM approval for core carbon principles label for VM47, and it was the first nature-based removal methodology to receive the CCP label. The other data point that we have is that other standards like isometric and equitable earth are also adopting dynamic baseline approaches, and a lot of their ARR methodologies look pretty similar to what we have put forward. So we think we have at least the basics of how to do that down pretty well. And then finally, just the adoption by project proponents. So we've seen 160 projects enroll under VM47 since it was released just a little over 2 years ago. So that kind of growth in interest in projects is a good sign that we're on the right page or on the right track. But I do understand that there's more work to do, and I want to see that 160 projects hopefully double or triple, because we need as much of this nature-based carbon removal as we can, and hopefully when those projects are done with their first one, they can jump right into the next one, and a lot of the technical details are streamlined, and they understand them better. So that's, I think, where we hope to go with VM47.
Perfect. Thank you, Spencer. Maybe Louis, maybe just building off of what you were explaining earlier about building like trust within the market. Can you maybe speak to a little bit more about what are some of the specific challenges in remote sensing with smallholders, and what continue to be some of the limitations, and how do you overcome these?
Sure. Great question, Laura. I think you hinted at a few of the biggest challenges earlier in your presentation. One is the scale. Obviously, the typical parcel would be a sub-hectare, and at a sub-hectare size, we really need to develop very accurate above ground biomass estimates or very accurate remote sensing solutions. So that's a challenge. That's the challenge we started to tackle when we were the first ones to release a 10-meter data product for above ground biomass estimates. And it's something we consistently work on. Another challenge that we see is the geographical spread of these projects. Sometimes we are talking hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of farms scattered around countries, sometimes few countries. So we need to download, process a variety of satellite imagery that are very different from one another, yet deliver consistent results across the whole project. A third challenge is heterogeneity. In one given parcel, there will be lots of things happening, not only for, as you mentioned, Andrea, the project itself. So we really need to build strong models that are able to understand different sort of landscape. And perhaps one thing where there will be more to discuss during this webinar is field data. It's a big challenge, of course, for project developers to acquire quality field data with the same protocol representative of the whole project. But it also poses challenges down the line when we leverage them to enhance the accuracy of estimates for us. So that's a point I think that deserves attention.
Perfect. Thank you. And finally, Rita, maybe we can build off of also what you mentioned earlier, which is one of the benefits. So I was wondering, what are some of the tangible benefits you've seen in the projects from dynamic baseline, maybe in addition to being able to monitor kind of using satellite imagery, but also have there been any limitations?
Sorry, it was a little bit, the question was for me?
Yes, sorry,
Yes.
Margaret.
I think that we've had some very in-depth conversations with Roman and Louis about technical limitations specifically, and I will address those in my presentation exactly. But we have specifically spoken about, theoretical aspects of geography, minimum mapping unit, for example. What's the smallest scale that you can go? So we have managed to find what is the most adequate size of the parcel and plots that we should be using to address those problems. But I think that other than our specific project, there's many other ways to address this. For example, taking in consideration the border effect of the analysis. You can also do stratifications for trying to homogenize your sampling areas. And but yes, it's been a very delicate issue that we have discussed very deeply.
Okay, thank you. I can't wait to dig into that further in your presentation. So I actually think now we are going to pass on to the presentations. I believe Spencer, you're first.
Great. I'll just wait for Kobe to pull those up and then we can walk through them. I think just at a high level too, it might be good for me to talk a little bit about one of the changes that happened in VM47 at the last revision. So I think a lot of the folks interested in smallholder projects are probably aware that we changed one of the requirements around the area-based and census-based approaches, and that we moved more towards the area-based approach for basically all project types that have trees that have vegetation or plantings at density greater than 50 trees per hectare. And a lot of our thinking on that was just that we saw the opportunity to use remote sensing and the tools that were coming forward to get down to these more granular scales and use dynamic baselines in those contexts, and that in the long run was going to uphold integrity and credibility of those of smallholder projects, probably better in the long run than the census-based approach. The census-based approach is probably where maybe the limitations of remote sensing kind of start to falter a little bit. We think that individual trees, it might be a little bit tricky to pick those out, and so at lower densities it could be hard to detect that stock change. We understand that 50 trees per hectare is in some places can be maybe a fairly low amount of vegetation or planting. But we do see applications for that in like silvopasture or some forms of agroforestry. And it seemed like there was, a sort of natural cut point there to say we have to draw a line, and we think that above that line, remote sensing could be used. And so that change, I think, sent some ripples through the system, but again, the response has been largely positive, and I want to credit a lot of the data service providers, including Canop, out there for sort of taking that opportunity to demonstrate that remote sensing at these smaller scales can be used to detect changes in locations under 1 hectare, and that with some of the 10 by 10 meter resolution data or even finer resolution data, that those vegetation changes in the project are detectable. So I wanted to just kind of put that out there and acknowledge that that change occurred and has prompted a lot of these conversations. I think they're good for us to be having and digging into. So I've put together just a couple 6 bullets on smallholder design considerations from our experience in looking at projects and seeing how these projects kind of come together and what seems to be working or being, what's a trend when we see these smallholder projects. So one of the things that I think is really important to start thinking about is whether you're going to do a grouped project. Most of the smallholder projects are grouped, and that's because the model seems to be that there's an initial enrollment of some amount of members of a community, and then the expansion of that might happen in a subsequent year. Either more members of the community are joining, or the program has moved to another community and you want to enroll another group of landowners. And so under that, it's really important to understand the group project design, sort of what's required. The VCS standard, both version 5.0, the new one that just dropped, and then our previous version have great guidance on grouped project design, what you should be thinking about. I think in the context of a dynamic baseline, it's almost easier to put together grouped project designs now, because you can think of every sort of annual cohort as its own sub-project, right? It's going to fit under this larger umbrella, but you're going to be putting together basically a group of individuals that have enrolled in that year, and that represents that year's project. So you may need to stratify from there. You may need to say, okay, we're going to do a certain type of planting in some properties and a different type in other properties, and we would sub-stratify per annual cohort, but those annual cohorts really represent sort of often a most granular unit at which you're doing dynamic baselines unless you're subsampling. And then within those annual cohorts, you're also that's where you're planning around your plot-based or field-based inventories. And we really want to emphasize here, because this is a question that we get a lot, that there's been some fear that every single property or instance that's enrolled has to have a plot associated with it, and that's not the expectation. So the expectation is that across your strata or annual cohort, whatever the case is, that you do some sort of randomized sampling for that area, and that you are then selecting just a subset of instances where plots need to be located to represent carbon stock change sort of as a whole for the project. So, in some cases that may mean that you're, putting one on every landowner, but I would be surprised if most of your instances are, at 1 hectare or around that size, and you're enrolling a couple hundred or even a couple thousand of them. You're only going to select a subpopulation of that or a subsample of that to represent the population. So hopefully that's clear, and folks are picking up on that in their design, that you're not going to every single property and putting in plots. I think related to that is that each of the annual cohorts or substrata does need to have its own performance benchmark. And this is important because we really base these performance benchmarks on matching at that time for that time period, right? So our matches are based on, randomizing what project pixels exist. And so those project pixels would, again, be all of the different landowners, the pixel that lays over top of their property, or pixels in some cases. And you'd be then able to, kind of group those and say, okay, this is our entire project area. We're going to randomize, select some of them, and then do our matching. And our matching needs to go back at least 10 years from that time point in order to get a good match. And so you're doing that for every strata, because over time those those conditions for matching could change, right? We could be seeing land use change, and you actually want to get a more accurate or representative set of control plots by doing that for each cohort and getting sort of the most accurate matches as possible. And then I want to emphasize that we're also only getting a subset of pixels. It's optional to go and use every single pixel, but the methodology specifies that in most cases, you're probably going to do some sort of random selection of project pixels and then do your matching to get the best matches available. And so that's, I think, an important just technical note that we often hear projects are worried that there's the cost of that is going to be really difficult, or they might not have enough control pixels. And I think if we put it into this sampling framework, then that's maybe less of a concern. And then finally, a question we get is whether or not it's even feasible to go out to all these control areas and get field-based inventories. And I really want to emphasize that is not the expectation. There is no expectation to go to control plots and do field-based measurement. What we're doing with the dynamic baseline is getting field-based inventories just in the project, and then we're getting remote sensing observations of both project and controls. So the relationship between carbon stock and stocking index is established just in the project, and then that same relationship with carbon stock and stocking index is assumed to be true in those control areas. So when you see a change in stocking index of 5%, and that looks like it's correlated with a 2% increase in above ground biomass, we use that same relationship over when we're looking at controls. So if we see that change in a control, we would assume an amount of carbon has increased or decreased according to the change in stocking index. And then Next slide, Kobe. It doesn't look like I can do it. Yeah, so the other set of questions that we often get is, setting a T0 estimate. So what this means is basically that we need to kind of know where you're starting from. There's going to probably be significant carbon pools in either above ground biomass, in some cases, other pools that could potentially be disturbed by planting. And so we want to capture that so we know, if your carbon stocks have gone up or down and by how much, right? So we have to sort of have this initial measurement in order to calibrate and say, okay, because of the project, this is the amount of increase that we have seen. And so that's why we have this language in there about a T=0. When we first put this out, one of the questions that we got was, well, I started a project, 3 years ago, and I didn't get my field measurement in right away. But so what do I do? Am I stuck? And we recognize that since we're already using remote sensing, that it would be, sort of a logical next step to allow the use of remote sensing to estimate above ground biomass, and then um, uh, through estimation also below ground biomass, basically to say, okay, if you didn't get those initial measurements, you can go back and use remote sensing to basically the same relationship that you're establishing through stocking index and on the ground measurements, and use that to estimate what was in the project prior to any start. And so we have allowed that now in the methodology, and hopefully that's a robust and rigorous way to establish T0, but also give projects a little bit more flexibility. And in the case of a lot of these smallholder projects, I think that's important because there's probably lots of landowners that may be getting started at different times. You may not know exactly when that's happening, and so it is still possible to allow that sort of T=0 measurement. We are now also getting a similar question around other carbon pools like SOC or litter, and in a lot of those cases, there isn't a good remote sensing estimate of those pools, and so we're thinking about how to approach this. Our current thinking is that a proxy site, a site that looks like the project just prior to implementation, might be a good way to kind of get at that. And so we are looking at developing that guidance out and including that in a CNC or a revision to VM0047 so that we can capture all required pools and get a time zero estimate. So, I think that last point sort of points to we're always, getting feedback, and it may not seem like it because it doesn't happen in maybe real time or as quickly as folks want. But as we get this feedback, we do try and incorporate that, update the methodology, make it more usable. If we see places where it has to be made more rigorous, we will also do that. But we really do try and learn from doing and putting it out there, maybe a few steps shy of perfection, knowing that we'll get that feedback and that we will also work to improve it. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Andrea, but thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe I'll just ask a quick question before we move on to the next presentation. But did Vera consider making any modifications to the methodology under the VM0047 to be more specific to the specifics of smallholder farmers, especially considering the complexity of this methodology? Exactly how you've explained it, it's quite complex. There's kind of the requirement to have remote sensing within the project, which could be a barrier for project developers and in the smallholder context. So did you go through any process to evaluate that?
So our process for getting feedback was like all of our other methodologies. So there was a public comment period when we launched the methodology, and then also getting feedback during the revision. When we announced that there was a time for public comment period. We've also engaged with groups like the Art of Forest and are also getting feedback, directly from project proponents. Our thinking is that this approach, while it is, complex, or it has that appearance, I think there's new tools that are coming online. So the ability to, work with some of these data service providers that can, are more streamlined and able to provide data, for projects, we see that as a real opportunity, and something we hope that, project developers working with smallholders can lean into as well. And then, that the approach itself isn't really that different than a large scale project, right? So if we're just thinking about lots of pixels dispersed across the landscape, or all of those pixels in one location, the sampling approaches are the same, right? Sampling approach for pixel selection is the same. Sampling approach for on the ground field-based inventories is the same. And so, our hope is that, like, by having more standardized approach here, that it does work, at scale for a variety of projects. We recognize, again, it's we're trying to hit, 90% of projects. There's going to be some edge cases that don't work for one reason or another. But yeah, if there's specific feedback about, what might, allow smallholder projects to integrate better, again, we're open to that.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's move on to Luis. Or
Margarita, I think.
I guess that's me. Yeah.
or Margarita. Sorry.
Thank you so much. So just to give you a little bit of context on our project, this is our project area in India. This is a forest carbon project, which is covers 3 districts. It's about 900,000 hectares total, the surface. But we are aiming at planting 2,500 hectares, which are all distributed on that area. And also to give you a little bit of context, in the histogram that you see below, this is the distribution of our first instance of plantations. Why do I want to show you that? Because most, like the biggest proportion of our plots are less than 1 hectare. And at the moment when we were collecting the farmers that would participate in the project, most of them didn't even reach a hectare, and we were still under the first version of the methodology, which didn't allow us to use the digital monitoring, the performance benchmark for less than 1 hectare. So the way that the turnaround that we found for this was for people to collectively join their land parcels so that we could reach the minimum size. According to FAO, like the statistic that I include in the slide, 68% of farms in India are marginal farmers. That means less than 1 hectare. So this was going to be a very complex project if we were also aiming at having access to carbon finance. So this is the type of context that like a traditional monitoring will struggle with. So can I see the next slide so I can continue showing you the context? So another layer to the complexity. So in green and purple, you see the plantation plots. And also blue dots that you see there, those are our 1-week visit that we did for the project. So each shade of blue is 1 day. So this is just for you to have an estimate of how hard it would have been to go census based on this project. You see, this is just visits to plots. We're not doing measurements, we're not doing inventories. So that's like a little bit of the context on the field reality. So can I go to the next slide, please? Without the dMRV scenario, so the logistics are complex. So like I said, yes, that's our team on the river. That's where we're walking to a plot that's not reachable. There's no bridges, there's nothing. We have to walk over there. The costs are elevated. There's always adventures like having your car blocked by a tree stump. And also we have difficulties. The only way we're going to cover all of that surface is going to be by using a different set of teams that are going to do different measurements, because we're human and we're not going to have the same standards when we do the measurement. So in the end, it's all going to come out as uncertainty. So what's the result of all of that? We're going to have an exclusion risk of small landholders because it's just too complex. And what I mean I'm not saying at all that census-based is bad, because I know this is the most precise way that we could do things. It's just context limited when we want to do a project on this scale. So can next slide, please. So with our dMRV, we had many challenges that we have found solutions for them, like the punctual measurements, the time that it takes between campaigns. Because by the moment when we're stopped measuring, doing the inventory for all of our plots, it's time to start again the campaign. The inconsistencies between the team measurements, and now we can, with our satellite information or remote sense information, we can do annual checkups. For some data, we could even do sub-annual follow-ups. We're going to have the same methodology for everyone. And of course, the human bias is going to be less. So we can do complete coverage. The time that we're going to save is a lot. This also means cost reduction. And in the end, it all translates into inclusion of all the participants. Now for Andrea, with for Andrea's question. So some of the limitations, because I don't want to come here like a technocrat and saying dMRV is going to solve all our problems. There's limitations, but we're considering them. For example, we are working with 10 by 10 pixel image. And even when we go back, when we go before 2017, we're going to have less resolution than that. But our project and control plots are 50 by 50 meters. So that would mean that for when we're working with the 10 by 10 resolution information, we can cover them with like a 50 by 50 plot can be covered by 25 pixels. So we're taking in consideration that. We also had the discussion when performance benchmark was opened, the area-based was open to less than 1 hectare project. What would be in anyway, what's the ideal size for a plot? So just according to the geographical theory, if we have perfectly square plots, like the ideal size for them would be a quarter of an hectare plot. But in the reality, it's not always going to be that, because plots are not always going to be completely square. We're going to have irregular shapes. But in the end, that's also another thing that we need to balance. You know, the inclusion of the project, we're working with human people, with humans. It's something that we need to consider. That beyond a size parcel, there's also a person. But we can also go to statistics, and just because I hadn't prepared to talk about exactly that data, but I can say that plots that go below 0.2 hectares are like maybe 1% or 2 from what we're working with right now. So so some of the limitations was the spatial resolution of the data that's available freely, which translate into uncertainty. But we can always use mitigation measures like aggregation, certification, aggregation of plots, like people coming together and work with their neighbors so that they can participate in the project. Field calibration, and we also always have a conservative approach. We're always looking for improving our methods. So the key is how rigorously we manage our information. And well, in the end, we know that we have been able to have our backs. So in the end, I'm going to go really fast on this slide because this is just my conclusion. The benefits for our small landholders have been lower costs. This makes the projects more accessible, fewer intrusive visits. Some of the people that work with us, they spend the day working on the tea gardens. And when they come back home, the last thing they want to do is get a visit by a field officer. So this will respect their local times, their local realities. Also, that means for our field teams, it's less coordination for them, less calls to the people, when can I visit you, and all of that logistics. So all of the small dispersed plots are more easily included, which allows the project to be more inclusive and for the project to have more stability. And another thing that I wanted to say is that we're not using dMRVs as a shortcut. We are conscious that it these are tools that allow us to be more rigorous and the project to be more feasible, and that in the end this is necessary to scale impact. To be able to include more people into the project. And just for my closing statement on the next slide, I really think that without this new method that has been included, a lot of the people that make part of our project, it would have been very difficult for them to participate. So thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. I think a question, and I see a lot of questions in the chat, are related to control plots. So how do you select the control plots to ensure they're representative of the farmers that are part of the project, especially when it comes to socioeconomic conditions like land tenure and household characteristics?
Yes, yeah, because we can divide the set, but you're talking about the control plots, how we select the
Correct.
control plots.
Yeah, correct.
I mean, I can talk to you directly about how we the socioeconomical conditions of the project plots. I mean, because we have direct contact with the people, we visit them, we have socioeconomical baseline that describes and assures the homogeneity of the people that are participating. And regarding the control plots, we have used spatial information because in the end it needs to be randomized. So we don't have a lot of control into what will go into the control plots, you know. But we do use all the spatial information that we can include into what we are calling the donor pool, and that includes land tenure. How do we how do we include any policies regarding forestry or agricultural measures that can happen in the area? And then also, well, of course, we need to exclude anything that has been already built up, or so in the end, we're looking for mostly natural areas and that also have geophysical similarities between the control plots that we are using. But yes, I think that's very important to note that this is a randomized choosing of the data. So
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to Luis since we are running low on time.
Thank you, Andrea. I'll try to be relatively short and succinct. So today I'll be talking about dynamic baseline as well as stocking index. Kobe, you can go on the next slide. Just wanted to put this here. I think it's important to have an understanding of how much we can see for different parcel size, both at 10-meter and 25-meter resolution. So that's something we have to keep in mind. And of course, all the parcels are not rectangular, as Margarita mentioned, but that's still, I think, figures that people should have in mind. So dynamic baseline is the process of comparing how biomass evolve in the project plots and also in control plots. And the way we do this is we use a stocking index that is an indicator that's derived from satellite imagery. Vera defines a stocking index as an index that's sufficiently correlated to above ground biomass. And the simple one that one can use is the NDVI, there's also EVI or EVI2 and a little bit more sophisticated indicators, but these have limitations. And one of the reasons we built CANOP above ground biomass estimates is to solve some of these limitations. So CANOP above ground biomass estimates come from a deep learning model that we've trained. It takes as input a variety of sensors, both optical and radar. They've been trained of tens of millions of hectares, and unlike NDVI, they can also be recalibrated. So that means we can further enhance the accuracy of our estimates using sample plots. So we can basically boost the accuracy. If you go to the next slide, Kobe. Thank you. Now I would like to illustrate what's the impact of choosing either the NDVI or Canop AI-derived AGB estimates on two projects for the dynamic baseline. We took one project in Senegal with plot size from 1 to 5 hectares, and we used 25-meter spatial resolution Bourgogne biomass estimates to make the dynamic baseline. And if you go on the next slide, Kobe, so here you can see the results. So you see the evolution of stocking index over time. And I think one thing that's really key to read here is two things. First is how more smooth the stocking index from above ground biomass estimates are compared to NDVI, and also how above ground biomass estimates are more confident and earlier in the start of the project. So it's better at picking up early biomass growth. And also there's less noise, as we will see on this project. This is a rather larger project for smallholders. It's 8 hectares, but there's been continuous plantations. And if you go on the next slide, so here we can see once again the stocking index, both Canop above ground biomass and NDVI. And I wanted to pick this one because NDVI is a really, really noisy estimate. And even as you can see before the start of the project, so before the red line, it varies quite a lot. And at the end, it even like goes down. So I think that's something that project developers should have in mind. And perhaps the last word, we'll be releasing a new model very soon. This will be, of course, accompanied by an accuracy assessment, like the one we have for our current model. And we can't wait to share this update with you. And reach out if you have any questions.
That was very quick. Thank you, Luis. Maybe just a question to follow up on what you've presented. At least in our experience, we've seen that we often have false positives when we use satellite imagery to determine whether deforestation has occurred, or at times the results show that the area that we're working in is actually forest when we know that it's like shrubland, or cocoa or coffee. So how are you able to avoid false positives and actually, ensure that what's picking up is forest growth and not something else?
Great questions. So for the deforestation, I think something that's quite key, especially in the tropics, is to use radar data, so SAR data, that basically sees through the clouds. A lot of the false positives one would get would be coming from optical issues from the optical data. And with respect to, sorry, I lost my train of thought. For classifying shrubs or other crops like coffee or cocoa as forest, I think that's something that has to do with how forest is defined. Forest cover is defined with 3 parameters: the canopy cover, the tree height, and also the size of what we consider to be a stand of forest. And I think playing with these parameters oftentimes reveal the truth. And if we use the FAO definition, sometimes we'll have a lot of like false positives. But I think choosing an appropriate definition is key too.
Perfect. Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left. So we'll take some of the questions that have been dropped by participants. So maybe one of the first questions, and maybe, I'll ask it and then direct it to someone. So how do we assess the accuracy of dynamic baseline estimates compared to field measurement approaches? Is there anyone on the panel who would like to take that one?
Well, I'll go and then I'll ask Louis to jump in. So the way that we think about this in VM47 is that really it's just a correlation between the two, that we need to see that there is a significant correlation between the stocking index and above ground biomass, and that we should see that both in documented literature for the stocking index that you're using, but also then seeing that in the project. So where you start to have project plots and looking then at your stocking index and basically doing that regression to say, yeah, there does look like there's a relationship here. We understand that that one of the big concerns is we see projects where they aren't they're worried that the relationship might not be that strong, but or that there's a way to game that as the other concern that we hear. And our thinking is that by sort of fixing project plots with stocking index, that if there is any error, that error is going to be the same in both projects and controls. And so there isn't, at least that I'm aware of, a great way to game that, to say, okay, we're going to sort of suppress the change in stocking index that we observe in the controls and allow that to be different in the project. And so, that's just a design principle in the methodology that so far we think is a pretty good way to ensure that those estimates of stocking index change are calibrated for both the project and the control plots to ensure that we're kind of making the same measurement in both locations.
I don't have anything to add on top of that, Spencer, and I also want to leave room for other questions.
Okay. There's definitely a few questions in the chat related to plot size. So this seems to be like on people's minds, especially we're talking about 1 hectare. So how robust are dynamic baselines when these plot sizes are usually much smaller than 1 hectare? Maybe Louise?
Yeah, I can give a few. The thing is, when we take a project plot, we usually aggregate different pixels, and we find that we can find project plots of 50 by 50 meter in most of the parcels, and by doing this aggregation, we actually make it more robust. I think the parcels that would be difficult would be thin strips, whereas it has as neighbors tens of major forests, for instance, or like more heterogeneous landscapes. So I think picking project plots well is something that helps for that. And Spencer, if you want to complement.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that we understand that polygons are of all sort of shapes and sizes, and there are some rules in there about, at least for the pixel dynamic, or the dynamic baseline pixel selection of like what can be a project plot. There are rules around it needs to be a pixel needs to at least cover 75% of, or be covered by 75% of the project area. So that does give you sort of a way to fit those odd shaped parts of the project. I want to emphasize though that that doesn't mean that those areas aren't included in the project. It just means that they're not being represented or representable by the pixel that overlays it, right? So if you think about lots of different shaped pixels, there are still going to be pixels that fall squarely within or entirely within, and that's really where the project is going to be represented, right? So that goes into this larger population, and then you can subsample from there and pull those pixels out. I don't see that as affecting the project area. So if you have these, like in Marguerite's slide, there are these little tails or places where they are implementing the project. It'd be great to be able to represent that, and as remote sensing imagery gets more granular, it may be even possible to include those and just have more pixels to represent those areas. But I think we do understand that if there isn't an exact overlap, that shouldn't cut off those parts of the project. It just means that they're not being observed with remote sensing for the dynamic baseline.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone for participating, the panelists and everyone who's on the call today. There's a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm really sorry we were not able to get to them, but it definitely shows a lot of interest in the topic, and certainly that there's still a lot of things for people to understand further. And I think part of that is on the technology side, and really, I think, Louis, you kind of nailed it at the beginning, talking about kind of building trust for those of us who are working on these types of plots. but also really understanding like what the implications are from the socioeconomic realities of the smallholder farmers that we work with, and ensuring, the methodology is really adapt to that to the context of the projects that we're involved in. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, I think.
Andrea, just want to say thanks for moderating and appreciate all the questions in the chat. And it looks like we should do another one of these soon. So yeah, great to see the interest, and yeah, happy to keep working towards this and make these the methodologies work for projects, because without that side of it, it's sort of a pointless exercise. So appreciate the work that you all are doing.
Same here. Thank you very much, Andrea, Spencer, and Margarita, for all these insights.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about our work.
Pleasure.